Welcome back to the Alexander Schmidt Podcast, episode 55. This is Side Quest 7, not usually done on this platform, but today is Memorial Day, and, well, this is just the way we decided to do it. Welcome back to Side Quest, Mr. Wes Schantz.
Hey, thanks for having me again. It's been a little while, but it's good to be back. And I like this
And,
format. So let's do Howl's
yeah,
Moving Castle.
Howl's Moving Castle by Hayao Miyazaki, seventh installment in our series, and one of the best, one of the most recent of the ones made. I think it was made in 2004, and it features a young woman who is sort of old before her time, working as a hat tailor, seemingly,
Uh-huh.
who refuses to go out and play with the other young ladies and to revel in the pleasures of the city and society that a young lady of her age is due. She seems to
Uh-huh.
be self-conscious of the fact that she's not as beautiful as her mother thinks she's not beautiful. And, well, who shows up at her door but a rather corpulent, amorphous figure in dark velvet and a sharp hat who calls her a tacky little girl who
Tacky.
is
Yeah. I
the
love that.
witch of the waste. Yes, tacky. I mean, saying to her this nasty thing that is exactly what Sophie, and her name is Sophie, like Sophia Wisdom,
Uh-huh.
that uh, that's exactly what she thinks of herself, that she's ugly and drab and plain and tacky, that there's nothing about her that's unique or alluring or interesting.
Right.
And so this figure, this amorphous, undefined, threatening witch figure from the waste is a prefiguration of the self and the feminine psyche. The self being both active in a man and a woman, but in this instance, she is an older, more mature, more powerful, but undefined woman. So she's an image of the ideal to some extent, but also conflated with the Jungian idea of the shadow, which
Hmm.
is these terrible aspects of a human that you are unwilling to recognize about yourself, like your vengefulness or your deceitfulness or your lack of ability to work hard or your unfairness to others, and how, because you generally manifest those qualities in small ways, not what you define as large ways, you write them off as if they don't exist. And so all those
Huh.
tiny little things form into a giant figure of the shadow, which
Right.
beginning of the development of the personality is still conflated with the image of the self. And in being so dark, it makes the image amorphous, and the less defined the image of the self or the ideal towards which one strives is, the more one is in a dark wood without a path. The less one is able to see the path forward. And so, what does this image do? Does it draw her forward into life, or does it cast her down? Does it eat away at her, you might say? Does it have a negative influence rather than a positive influence? And so it seems like it sort of has both at first, right? It
Hmm.
it steals the vitality from her life. It ages her prematurely, but in so doing also gives her the motive power to move forward in her life, though at a greatly reduced, uh, well, with a major time limit imposed on her, and
Yeah.
the curse of age. I mean, so it's interesting. So she loses her vitality and her looks even more, and her voice even becomes. It's nice that this seems to be a throwback to Spirited Away, but I believe the same voice actor does this granny as the Yubaba character, who was the head of the band.
Right.
They even look
They
very similar.
they totally sound the same. I think it's a famous actress too. Like all these movies, they get like really top-notch quality for the English versions on them.
Yeah, Hal is
Like
Christian Bale. I mean, so
yeah,
really top notch stuff.
yeah. So she's turned into the old woman, and yet in a sense it's sort of like a freeing thing, right? Because she's freed from
Right.
all of the kind of pressures and
Mm.
insecurities. It's like she can sort of let go of those things, um, and well, she in a way becomes the person that she always like envisioned herself as in her own mind, right? Like as you put it, she's become old before her time, even before she physically has that appearance. And it seems like it also sort of uh, has an effect on her, like her strength, right? She's sort of like slowed down and enfeebled, um, but she's still like such a hard worker.
Right. And she's still and something I neglected in my initial analysis is that Hal does take her arm when she's still young near the beginning, which also sets things in motion. And so he's like the spirit Mercurius, which the alchemists and the Jungians, quoting him, and the Petersonians would mention, the spirit inside matter that garners one's interest, and in drawing one towards it, the information that it has latent within it will be activated, which will change the person's life. It's like the genie in the lamp sort of idea, and Aladdin going down to the underworld in order to get that knowledge. And so there seems to be some affection between her and him, and so he is what is called the Animus figure in Jungian psychology, which is the prefiguration of the self as well. So her ultimate self will be feminine because she is herself feminine, but the figure that draws her into life is the Animus, which is masculine, just as with the men, they have an Anima figure, which is feminine. And so
Gotcha.
he is still an airy sort of wizard, right? And so that indicates that he is still like very much spirit, not so much rooted in reality. And in fact, he has like sort of a shaky relationship to reality, right? He's a part of two kingdoms. He has a house with very tiny legs that looks very slipshod, which is very poorly cared for, which can go to 4 different locations. He himself is a blonde-haired, beautiful man who seems to look myopically at everyone around them and never show affect, until his hair gets changed to the darker, more earthy black, which sets off a major catastrophe in his personality and his view of himself, and revealing how shallow he is. What's the point of being alive if I can't be beautiful?
Right.
And so that's effectively her, our main character, Sophie's perception of like the ideal man. And so there's some problems with it, right? Like he does not measure up in many ways, though he's powerful and magical. He doesn't have any home skills or domestic skills, and he doesn't care about anything, which is something we find out later, that he has given his heart over to magic or to his creative endeavor. And so he can't give his heart to anything else. And so long as he's producing magic or creativity, and I think we can see this happening in Hollywood and many creative endeavors now, he doesn't feel responsible for the rest of the actions in his own life. And so he's refused to take moral responsibility for the harm he's done as a wizard, and as he's known as a womanizer. And so
he steals their hearts and eats them, right?
Right.
The girls tell each other.
That's the rumor about him. And well, given that that's what the Witch of the Waste does, that it's potentially true, that sort of thing that happens. And even at a metaphorical level, what does that mean? That he steals the pleasure of a moment from an experience that's supposed to be much richer and deeper, makes those around him who were once sweet potentially bitter. I mean, look at the Waste. She said that she once loved Hal, and he said that she was once beautiful, but then he realized she wasn't. And so who knows whether that was a spell that he cast on her that revealed her for truly what she was, or whether he did to her what he had done to all the other women before, her bitter and terrible because of his treatment of her. And so that's a very unsophisticated, even as just a character, that's a very unsophisticated person, right? Even though he is extraordinarily talented, he is completely isolated by his gift because of his unwillingness to reflect social mores or to take a position of responsibility within the world, right? He still needs to
cipher, right? He's a kind of cliche, and in this movie strikes me as following some of the kind of patterns that we saw in the other ones, but but it seems to me that this one does, as you say, it does less of a job of giving you a full character, and that seems to be sort of the point, right? He's more
Right.
like a type than an actual person when you first meet him.
Right. And something that we were attempting to parse out before we got on the phone is that this seems to be sort of like a Japanese Beauty and the Beast tale, but it's even more sophisticated than Beauty and the Beast. Whereas in the Disney version of Beauty and the Beast has to learn how to use his aggression in order to fight for something he actually cares about, which I would say actually now articulating that is fairly sophisticated. Well, that's precisely what Hal has to do as well. He has to use his art in the service of something that means something to him rather than just be an outlaw because he refuses to be bounded to anything, which actually makes me think that that's perhaps why Ronin are called scum by samurai, that they fight without honor. They have the gift, the creative gift of being able to, fight, but they don't find it in a responsible manner to something which is of importance to them, which seems to be the ultimate game. And in fact, that reminds me very much, no spoilers here, of last night's Westworld.
Okay.
And perhaps the point of even having a territory or a home to give one something to fight for, to bring the best out of one for. Yeah. And so just to sort of jump way ahead because of that, it is interesting that Hal eventually does give a ring then to Sophie after they've done a lot of growth. So one thing that she sees in him, just like in the Eros and Suke myth, just like in Beauty and the Beast, is she sees Hal when he's turned into a war beast, right? He's turned into this black raven with still a human face that fights these faceless, sort of these faceless, oily magicians of darkness in these aerial combat scenes. And so he has to turn into a monster to fight against them. And this even has echoes back to the Iliad, right? Where Hector has to become a monster in order to fight against other monsters. And this is indicated by the fact that his son cries when he sees the helmet on Hector because he sees his father as the monster he can be. But then when his father takes the helmet off, he sees him as the kind, benevolent father that he can be. And so he has the two images of sort of Zeus or the great father there, the vengeful, terrifying aspect and the protective, loving aspect. And it is precisely that protective, loving aspect which Hal has refused to embody because he, like a Peter Pan figure, does not want to be bound to anything, right? His house moves. He's not bound to a certain land. He has 4 different places that he can exist at any particular time in the house because it has a magical door with a red, black, I think blue and yellow switch.
Yeah, the switch changes even at a certain point in the movie, so it doesn't even open the same 4 places throughout the whole movie. So there's this constant mutability about it, and I think that goes along with the there's definitely that color thing going on, like you mentioned, whereas he starts out with the brilliant white hair, blonde hair, or whatever, and then later, once they start cleaning up his room for him against his wishes, then he comes back and his product is changed and it changes the color of his hair, which he has to, it's like rearrange his whole identity, right? He's sort of got this image of himself which is so fragile, it turns out, despite how powerful he is as a wizard.
That's right. And you were asking earlier what you thought the function of Markle, his young apprentice, was. And I think I've just had a thought on that perhaps what Markle is Hal's vulnerable self-image of himself, because though he is a boy, he's also potentially the emotional age of Hal, because we see that Hal gave up his heart at a very young age. He was something like 12, 16. He was some young man when he caught the spirit, which was Calcifer, and bound it to him. And so perhaps because of that original marriage, that's why he feels he can't take on any additional responsibilities because Calcifer or creativity is a jealous mistress. That's I think, very interesting.
He's like he's like a father in that way, that he has this kind of magical creativity. He's like a father in that he's got this kind of house, and he's got a kind of family there between Calcifer and Markle. If you, and then but on the other hand, he's got no roots, as you put it earlier. And so I think it's an interesting dilemma where he, in some sense, he kind of puts the pause button on himself in order to embrace this spirit from the heavens, this fire spirit of Calcifer, and then once he's done that, he keeps that locked away, right? He's got that one door that opens to the meadow, lake.
Oh yeah, that too.
And it's like that's the thing that he finally shares with Sophie. He gives her the ring that she can come back to. He seems willing to kind of give himself up at that point, though. He still hasn't. It's like he's willing to show her some aspects of himself, but then he immediately goes away again at that point, to sort of, sacrifice himself, perhaps go out in a blaze of glory, sort of thing. So right up until the very end, it seems like he's still not entirely committed to actually living, and creating something with his life. And I think the movie ends on, I mean, I'm puzzled by Markle for sure, but I'm also sort of puzzled by the end of the movie. Like it's not entirely clear to me how certain or how stable the kind of family that they've created turns out to be at the end.
Well, let's pause on that just for 1 second, because you've given rise to a host of ideas in my mind. But just to show the parallel structures of this story and Beauty and the Beast, it is precisely when he decides to give to Sophie that which is most meaningful to her, the thing which is beautiful to her, the garden, which is of meaning to him. And so they share a garden together, or an Edenic sort of place, which is made all the more magical by the fact that it means something to him. And so now she shares something of meaning with him, just like when the Beast gives his library to Belle, because that is the thing of, well, infinite value to her because she loves books, but also because it is something that he chose to give to her because she would love it. And so not exactly the same situation, but very close. When something of value, extraordinary value from the man or the animus figure is given to the woman in order to show that he is willing to give something up for her, indicating through express sacrifice her worth to him. And that strikes me as profoundly deep. And so what then he does is shows that he can fight for something that he believes in, which is fighting against these forces of darkness in the war. And I'm not trying to paint too good of a picture of him, because he does do tons of cowardly stuff. In particular, trying to send Sophie in to talk to Madame Sullivan without him there, which, not to be forgotten by any means. But that he, when he does go to fight, he is, it seems, trying to show that he's willing to die for something that he could take responsibility for. But ultimately, that is not as hard as living with responsibility. And so it's sort of like the death of the childhood heroic ideal of growing to one's peak and then dying in sacrifice for something one believes in, and getting to the more sort of fatherly, adult, responsible perception that, well, actually, maybe I should clean up my act and learn how to take care of those around me, rather than just, reaching this sort of peak of childhood and strength and never having to develop any of that. Which then leads to Calcifer being freed, or his single-minded devotion to the creative endeavor, just like Aladdin giving up the genie in the lamp or making him free. He gives up the infinite possibilities of creative life plus youth in order to focus on the realities of his present situation. In Aladdin's case, his kingdom. In Beauty and the Beast's case, his kingdom, which is he's actually redeemed his kingdom at this point by doing something so extraordinary and sacrificial that he earns the love of somebody else, which is not something he could have done as the selfish narcissist prince he had been growing up.
So, like, as you're sort of pointing out, the exchange seems to go two ways. Then it's like to one side of it, the figure of the Animus meeting Sophie, right? But to the other side of it, can she be read as his Anima figure then? Like, has he, or is there some other sort of ideal to which he aspires once he realizes that being with her would be better than keeping this moving castle thing going indefinitely?
Well, that is interesting because he does offer her ground, right? Garden, something to root himself, and he does give her a ring too, like putting a fence around a garden makes it your garden in the Lockean sense, that you've now put work in and now this place is yours. And I guess in a more abstract way, humans do that by putting work in like, say, sports or any sort of endeavor, and then that territory becomes partly theirs, and they'll even compete with other people to prove that the territory is theirs, right? Which is sort of interesting. And so yes, she could be the Anima. And what's interesting is that when she first presents herself to him after being transformed, she's an old woman that's just there to clean his house. And that shows his immature idea of the function of a woman, right? He sees women as two things: old women who clean and cook and take care of the kids, and young women to flirt with and steal the hearts of. He's totally missing the middle part of the equation that would make for an ordered house. And the fact that his house is disordered and that he has a place of darkness where he has to go suffer alone, marked by the black quartet or quaternion of the four-part circle, which is a symbol of the self too for Jungians, and like the mandala. But yeah, he's missing the woman as in her most substantial form, which is the everyday woman with whom he would have to interact, the everyday feminine. He only sees the fun and frivolousness and the worker aspect. And so yes, so his idea of her has to develop, and he has to realize that women are not just there to serve his needs at the present moment, but there to be the ultimate symbol of responsibility, or that which you would be most willing to sacrifice yourself for, and thus bringing out the absolute best in you as a man. And so when he simply sees them as extensions of his own sort of pleasure in life, that doesn't bring about the circumstances necessary to bring out what is actually most human and most dignified and best in him, that which will effectively make it so that he never has to be a beast again. Ending the war externally and internally at the same moment. Snap.
Yeah, the war, yeah, so like the black, that's the kind of like terrain or whatever of his expression of his power or something like that, right? So it's like the very same thing that could be fearful or destructive. Like that's the thing that he's devoted himself to up until this point. And those scenes in the movie are like rendered really differently from the rest of the action, right? Like they look like they're from some other movie entirely in a way. And then so like gradually as the movie goes on, it seems like you get this kind of breakdown between those distinct areas, and that's sort of like, you see that happen too with the moving castle itself, right? Like it just like gradually gets destroyed like throughout the course of the movie. It's awesome to watch. And then by the end you have like this one little gear going back and forth. It's awesome. But like so it's an interesting kind of like process then, if you're thinking about it in terms of like the kind of the work that you have to put in to become a real person or something like that. Like there's an awful lot of just kind of destruction that has to take place first. It looks
That's
like
right.
to kind of
That's
get
right.
back to the real thing that's underneath it. Yeah.
And I would say that that's what the real message, unfortunately for Donnie Darko, of the short story The Destroyers. So the whole idea behind The Destroyers is there's an old curator who thinks that he's something because of that which he's accrued. And so he's the old blind king. He's tradition, right? He's Howl's castle at the beginning. Look at what it's become. It's nasty and chimeric and on a weak foundation that keeps him totally divided against himself into this young figure who pretends to be old and wise, which is him pretending to be old and wise to himself. And he's totally separated from the source of his creative insight. He's enslaved it to this single-minded endeavor. And so when a new part of the house enters, he doesn't even notice it at first. That's how disorganized his psyche is. And so the whole thing, like you said, has to be burnt to the ground. Has to be taken out. His old framework has to be pieced apart so that he can build on solid ground, something that is rooted, something that can actually grow out from the earth. It's not artificial, because ultimately that's what his creativity misses. That's what, like, say, one of the lower alchemists would miss. You can't produce the reality of relations with your mind or with your creative spark. It has to serve your real relations and the real people who exist on the earth, not just your ideas of how things should or could be, which would be essentially the, Luciferian use of the rational intellect to criticize the world as it is because it can see how the world should be better. It's like, no, you serve rational intellect. When you see how the world could be improved, you then figure out how to do that. But you don't make, the purpose of the rational intellect, the purpose of the creative insight, which Hal has, ultimately is not to tear down the world around him as he shows that he is attempting to do through fighting in this war, but to create something enduring and real. And that means that he has to take his place in the world in an actual single place that's rooted to the ground with a real woman. And what happens with Sophie, which I think is interesting, is that, like so in so many of Hayao Miyazaki's movies, you like work off the curse through your deeds, not through just learning some magical words, which would of course be our current conception of how to deal with every problem, right? Learn some magical words and you'll get out of it, rather than having to go through a journey. It's often a journey through the underworld or some sort of personal hell. And so what happens with her is she's returned to her original form, except her hair stays silver. He comments on that. And so both of their hair is changed by their interaction with each other. Both become less beautiful in the other's eyes because they are no longer just projections of the anima and the animus, which are images of perfection that humans project onto each other. And that's why you can fall short of it to other people. And how you can fall in love with like people who look very, very different, because you'll just project the same image onto them and you'll fall in love with that image. But what's happened by the end of this that gives the stable foundation to them, and like you mentioned in a recent podcast about in the Odyssey, gives the highest good to the Greek world, a good marriage, is the fact that they now see each other for what they really are.
Yeah.
not just the images that they portray to the world. And so that's made them less, but also more beautiful. Less beautiful because they're not just fantastic images of perfection, but more beautiful because they're far more profound and deeper and richer than any superficial image of perfection could possibly be.
Yeah, yeah, no, I think, I mean, the kind of trajectory there is really interesting because there's that kind of element of effort and building up that's taking place at the same time, right? They're sort of seeking, like, where can we have our house be, right? And so briefly they end up back in the hat shop. Like that's one of the Magic Doors new locations that they sort of set up shop at. And it's like, it seems like it's a slightly premature one though, because they haven't like settled that ongoing war. And it sort of like comes home to roost. And the other image of that too is the kind of the nefarious vizier to the king of the one kingdom, right? The Madame Sullivan or Soliman.
Solomon.
Yeah, so she's really, really interesting, right? Because she was Howl's teacher back in the day, and like saw his potential, but is now, trying to basically trap him, right? And sort of neutralize him because he's become too dangerous. But the trap that she sets seems to be that of narcissism in a way, right? It's like when she captures the Witch of the Waste, it's with mirrors and with these like these huge light bulbs that turn on and like fry her to a crisp, right? And that's the sort of thing that will never trap Sophie, right? So it's like her strength is of her sort of meekness or something like that. In that sense, she makes a kind of great counterpart to Howl, who could perhaps have ended up like the Witch of the Waste if not for Sophie sort of appearing when she does. And he, so then he shows up. He doesn't have to go up the stairs like, painstakingly. It's like hard to watch that portion where they're like creeping up the giant staircase. Instead, he flies in on the little ornithopter bike thing and is in the guise of the king, right? Yeah. So I found that like a really interesting little, like, a counterpart sort of image to the destruction of the house. Are these sort of attempts to take stock, to make this effort, but it seems like without the correct end or the correct relationship between the characters, it's just not gonna hold up. And I still, but just the last thing there, like at the very end, part of what makes me unsure about the quality of that relationship is still that there's this other, there's Pumpkin, what's his name? Not Pumpkinhead, but Turniphead, man. So what's Turniphead doing there? Like, he's still out on the loose. You got to watch out for Turniphead, Hal.
So I see Turniphead less as an Orestes spurned figure who's going to come back and kill Neoptolemus at some point, and more as a figure of the divine child who is the bringer of peace. The symbol of the perfect unifier of a relationship. The third aspect of the Trinity. I know people will say it's actually the second, as the Son, but that's fine. That which is born of peace between two people is the peace that will be between two peoples.
Gotcha.
And in fact, I think the Aeneid does a good job of trying to lay this out, that through marrying the Latin princess Lavinia to the Trojan prince Dardanian, technically, Aeneas, they will bring peace about without conflict, and they attempt to do this except for the prejudices against foreigners, which the farmers show are too powerful. And so also the innate fury that comes up in the form of Alecto due to Juno keeps that from happening. But so I don't see him as a rival lover. And something interesting about him is that he too is blonde, and actually there are those little shiny marks all over him when he first comes about, which not only means that he's shiny and new, but particularly a figure of like sort of a hermetic Hermes-like figure. Part also of the idea of the Animus, because something you notice is that when he leaves, he just bounces off on the air on his cane. He's a spirit. He's also a mercurial spirit. He is going to be the spirit, I would say, of love between the kingdoms, and also between Sophie and Howl. What's going to finish Howl's education?
Okay.
Effectively. Solomon, though, is very interesting in that she's sort of motherly, but dark motherly, right? She has that Tiamat aspect in that she attempts to flood Howl. She actually retreats into the waters, right? So she becomes the waters of chaos. She becomes the Ouroboros. She becomes that which releases all the despair and negative affect into man, into the hero. And so how he's eventually going to have to defeat her, which he does not do, is like Marduk, he needs to bind her in some way. And so I wonder to what extent he binds her by binding himself in relationship to a real woman. I wonder whether that is, in fact, what the purpose of a marriage and like a tribe and a country even is for somebody. Although that's like sort of a giant connection, which would take some time to detail out.
It's certainly those two loose ends. I mean, that does make some sense to think about it on the sort of macro scale of the state and its long-term sort of goals, or whatever you might want, if you could speak of it as having goals.
Of course, at least propagation of itself and reflective of that natural instinct. I mean, I don't think it's inappropriate to say that a state would have goals to increase its own welfare, and the welfare of the states that support it and the entire world. I would say that we can criticize ourselves for not acting appropriately on those aims, but we do seem to actually legitimately care about them. And just an interesting statistic that Steven Pinker brought to my attention today is that in the last 100 years or so, and that time frame could be off by some amount of years, social spending by the government has increased from 1% to 22%. And so, to suggest that we don't care about our people, and that we haven't, progressively been caring more and more and more as we generate more and more and more wealth in our people, it's just plain wrong. Though inequality hasn't increased. And that's a function of a greater and greater surplus that more and more of it ends up in fewer and fewer pockets, though the people who occupy those spots do change. And so whether it's fair or not is sort of who you compare it to. But nobody keeps anybody from getting any of that. Well, what a weird digression to have gone out on.
The state as wanting something of its people and for its people beyond sort of just their like mere submission. I think that's a pretty optimistic. So you've got the king, and he seems to be like really interested in how he can just like destroy as many of the enemy's ships as possible. Like in that brief moment that we actually see.
Howl. He's like a Captain Hook figure in that he's just a typical brash, uncreative, killing male. He's part of the problem, and he's willing to use magic, which is what Howl has to offer, which is of infinite value. But he's willing to use it to cause suffering. And so that's something that Howl can't yet square away. Like when one of us, a millennial, has to square away 40 hours of his or her time to like produce an income. And those are your precious hours, and that's your precious soul, and that's like a tyranny held over you. And it is a small tyranny, but it also opens up new doors as well that you could not have seen before, or you could have just faintly apprehended but not walked through. Like perhaps now, if you were a music lover, you have less time to sit around and listen to music while under the duress of negative emotion because you don't have a job or way to support yourself. But now you can maybe go to more concerts because you have more money. And so, the the figure of the king is limited in what he offers. He offers order and stability, and he does ask a price in being slightly tyrannical and taking something of your time and allegiance from you. But he is ultimately a figure for seeming good, except for the way about which he seems, which is by sucking the powers out of the wizards and witches that show up, which I guess would be the machinery of the state during war, using the resources, creative and intellectual, of the people in order to maintain or win a conflict. But that the ultimate use of these powers would be to recognize that the conflict needed to be won within in order to bring peace about. And
that seems to be the claim, right? It's like that the psychological states and things are true of the individual, but also the collective on some level.
Well, if you consider society sort of like a shared mental vision, and which regulates emotional states of people, which is why you can't reduce it to race, religion, or even language or anything, because it's that complicated. It's an entire vision of reality that we teach to people, and that they can see, and that's why it's not propaganda, because you sort of teach that it exists. You and detailed out its aspects, and how we sort of behave. You don't control how that actually is. If you teach that wrong, people will immediately tell. And so, sorry, just getting caught up thinking about that as an actual claim. Sorry, what was I responding to there, Wes? Because
just the idea that the collective is a kind of macrocosm of the individual.
And so, with how quickly we can distribute information to each other, the idea that a mental state could go from one person to multiple people and then reflect an agreed upon emotional response and action pattern to go with that. It's like, that's exactly, it's what happens in the individual certainly happens in the community in that aspect, because we are so tightly wound as to be very sensitive to the small differences that people exhibit and what that means, because we perceive things symbolically, which is why we can play video games and we understand the narrative structure from different times and places, and it makes perfect sense to us and is even enjoyable. And it's like, well, we're always doing that. We're still doing that. We just don't recognize it because the game is present to us right now, or invisible to us because it is present.
Right. It's like you're sort of on the game board or something.
Yes. You don't. If you were a cynic, you'd say you don't see your prison bars. Right. And so, what seems to be necessary is the development of the individual, not the crushing of the individual. Because no matter how many individuals you crush, you will never win that war, because that's not how a war is actually won, through sheer power and force, but through a culture overcoming itself, through an individual effort to recognize in himself the causes of war, the evil which produced the war, and to achieve a moral transformation necessary to give the moral high ground to his people, which enables them to sue for peace.
Yeah, I think one other way to think about Markle, actually, now that I'm like, I don't know that there's any real evidence for this in the movie, but I like to think that maybe he's a kind of like a war orphan or something, like he's Howl, found on one of his strafing runs, destroying a bunch of enemy ships, and he saved this kid, and so I don't know, I guess there's just elements about the movie which I'm okay like letting be a bit of a mystery, because I think the overall aesthetic picture that it draws, and all of the sort of insights that you can glean from just kind of beholding that whole picture are really it's really awesome. I mean, it's not one that that, like I said, immediately strikes me as having as interesting of characters and stuff going on as some of the others, but the total picture of it is like fascinating, like thinking about the castle and just Howl's bathroom and just everything, all things that, when you put them all together. And the scene of him like reaching Calcifer, like reaching out to Calcifer, and that there's all the little mini falling stars happening like in the meadow there by the lake. I think that's just such a dreamlike image.
Chosen by a star.
It's fascinating. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and, the washroom, which makes you dirtier than it does make you clean. That he is not capable of redeeming himself at that moment. I think, yeah, that's fascinating, and I would agree that it the the story shares less of a traditional narrative structure than, like, say, a Spirited Away or a Princess Mononoke, which is a little more clear cut in what it is. It's more formed, whereas this is more sort of stream of consciousness or even unconsciousness, I would say. Whereas it gives flow to archetypal images, sort of like Jung's Red Book. And I know that that's something that Miyazaki would sometimes do, just start painting the pictures and write the story secondarily. And so this could have been an even more fantastical attempt, because there is so much archetypal imagery in it that's very helpful to pursue. And there does seem to be sort of an underlying story of personal growth, not only in the feminine, but also in the masculine, and recognizing that the true source of peace comes from harmonizing those two sides of human existence. And so it's as if it has one of the most profound meanings underlying it, and very much well representing the pathway of individuation in both masculine and feminine psyches, is what I would say it seems to have. And yet still not be as provoking and meaningful a unique story as, say, a Spirited Away. Whereas Spirited Away hits the archetypal so profoundly and even uses expressly archetypal material, it still has a deeply personal or idiosyncratic nature, right? Like, even if you compare it to Alice in Wonderland, it is not Alice in Wonderland. It's its own standalone movie, which would be the criticism of Episode 7 Star Wars, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Without the first Star Wars, which it seems to mirror entirely, it's nothing, right? It's the reflecting pool, not Narcissus. The narcissistic endeavor as an empty reflection is an interesting idea. There, all is vanity, says Ecclesiastes, right?
Well, only if you're not beautiful.
Oh, very good, very good, very good. Okay, yeah. So, well, yeah. We was there anything last you wanted to cover on this? I just sort of thought about the process by which the power seemed to be taken away from the Witch in the Waste. Is that what happened? And the dancing star people who dance with their hands around, like, I was wondering if, and I made the claim that Solomon, she uses the powers of Tiamat, or the ocean, the salt water, that which is tragedy inducing or causes tears, and is the unrestrained process of nature, or power of nature. And so I was wondering if these stars sort of represented, like, the cycle of time, and how that which nature gives, it will certainly take back. And that what Solomon was doing was sort of speeding up the process of time and sucking the juice out of the person. And what made me also think that is the fact that those star people are what were falling out of the sky, and one of which was caught by Howl, which he gave his heart to in order to embody it and give it life.
Yeah, no, they seem to be a kind of shadowy stars too, though, right? Like they wheel around the person, and they seem to kind of mesmerize,
Yes.
and like, if magic in some sense is analogous to this process of becoming a real person, then what you're seeing there, I suppose, is the person being so sort of so deceived about where they stand on that journey, right? That they're easily controlled, or they sort of lose their vital spark.
Well, that is interesting, because the head do not move position. They're always turned over the left shoulder, so they're sort of turned backwards as the sun as the stars go forward, and they move in a counterclockwise position, indicating going towards unconsciousness rather than consciousness. And so their attention is completely directed at the Witch of the Waste when they're going to take her powers away. So it's like sort of a narcissism, right? Without understanding that time is passing and one is wasting away in one's vanity. And so, yes, that sounds pretty good. One is overcome with the creativity within oneself until poof, it disappears without one ever having manifested something with it. Even a complete personality being not the least important thing one could make through the process of creative transformation. A responsible human capable of dealing with problems seems to be what brings two kingdoms back together. And so it's represented by the highest possible symbolism. And so it's almost as if you're only a muggle insofar as you fail to understand that the spirit of interest, which draws you into things, is that which will sort of redeem you and the entire world.
Yeah. The thing about her too is like, as she has, absolutely lost all of her potential, she still is she's still taken care of, right? Like Sophie and Howl agree that they're not just gonna like abandon her now that she's essentially enfeebled. They
take on the little coughing dog as well. Their family expands. Their sphere of competency with relations expand, and so does their family. And what does that mean? That means they can take more responsibility on and further stabilize more aspects of the community all at once.
Yeah. So it's like there's never no hope. It seems to be the message there. Like there's on the one hand, there's always people who are gonna fall short of the highest goals, but on the other hand, there's other people who are gonna come in and attempt by whatever means to like reconnect those people to whatever it is they may lack, need.
That's interesting, because that suggests to me sort of an alternative, potentially even more sophisticated reading of, like, say, the unjust employer at the vineyard story from the New Testament, who takes in the people for 8 hours and 7 and 6 and 5 and 4 and 3, 2, 1, which is also analogous to the idea of the vine, that there's the new vine and the old vine, but they're all equal. That it's like sort of that each of these people is equal in that they play a part in the same story, and that makes them equivalent in some respect. But the people who do, the 8 hours, it's like they're like the stars of the show. You know what I mean? And so it's like there is an equality in the eyes of God as the creator of the story.
Right.
There. But there's also an inequality in that you get to spend more time as a part of the story.
Right.
And so the gift seems to be the problems you face in reality.
Yeah,
because you get to manifest more of what you actually are in the realist story which exists, which is even used to shape the stories of the people yet to come, because the people who make the most dynamic impacts through struggling the most, generally speaking, are the people who get remembered. And so we pass down, their images because they seem to embody a certain type which has eternal value, and that seems to be the transformative hero who's willing to engage in exploratory behavior in the face of the unknown willingly. And that can manifest in infinite ways in each one of our lives. And so you might see that as the letter from Hogwarts, whenever it manifests in your life, whenever anomaly reaches up and is calling your attention to itself. And I think Sophie got to see that and got to walk through the city with Hal, and then got to walk through the world with Hal, which was a very different experience.
Oh yeah.
And that might be the difference between persona and the actual world, right? That when she's just going through the city in a whirlwind with him, and he has to away against or run away from the forces of darkness, which are external to him at first, and then through the course of the entire movie, she sees much more about him than just that initial persona image,
Right.
and gets to see what's also ugly and unworthy in him, like his cowardice,
Mm-hmm.
and unwillingness to take responsibility and grow up, and even to keep himself clean. But
Yeah, I love when she's about to clean the house and she's like she warns Markle and he runs back to his room to like hide all his secret stuff from her. It's really cute. That part. I like that.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, is there anything left uncovered? I mean, besides the infinite amount that we always miss?
Well, I mean, we've got to figure out which one next.
All right. All
the-
right. I have a suggestion. I have
all
a
right.
suggestion on this. I would suggest Castle in the Sky because I just bought it.
Far Out. Yeah, that makes sense.
We're going back into the past on this one. I mean,
I'm-
yeah, another castle in the sky, because that is what happens to House Castle at the end, right? Now it's
Yeah.
no longer a walking castle, but it can fly, which perhaps that's something you were having an issue with, because I think
Yeah.
the correct image would not be so much that it can fly. Perhaps it's an image of the kingdom of heaven, which can be present everywhere in that respect. So that might be good. But if these were actual figures and not just archetypes, they should be rooted somewhere.
Right. Right.
So they can't just float off anywhere. An idea that is disembodied, like Voldemort in the first Harry Potter, is not a very useful or operant idea.
Right.
You need to see the idea in action. And so Castle in the Sky will be interesting because we'll see, perhaps an earlier iteration or prefiguration, like the prophets before Jesus of the same story. And Mark Hamill too, I know, as a voice actor in the English language version. So that'll be a treat. That will be a treat.
All right.
Yeah. So sounds like you are amenable to that. See a natural, intuitive connection between them, as you would say.
I'm on board. Yeah. Sounds good.
All right. Well, thank you for indulging in another adventure of the imagination, an adventure of ideas, as Alfred North Whitehead would say. Another concentration and contemplation and associative game.
Right on. Yeah,
But
my
also,
pleasure.
yeah. And a pleasure as always to have you. And this is again Mr. Wes Schantz of Bookworm Games. You put out, I believe, 2 episodes this weekend. So you're doing a lot of work alongside your teaching gig too. So this is a hardworking man.
Well, just trying to catch up. I hope that we'll be hearing more Iliad podcasts from you when you get a chance. I know you're a busy guy. But...
Yeah. I think I might have to drop one this week. I've been off it for a little bit of time while I've been developing this Milton unit that I've been teaching, and it's been sort of blowing my mind and developing my understanding of the relationship between all these epics, and even the relationship to my own life, my own personal tragedies and falls and conflicts that I've run into. And so it's been a deeply personal journey too, but I'll be sure to infuse all my lectures to come with all those details as well, to keep them fiery and interesting, because you can't separate the heart from the mind. You can't separate Calcifer from Howl. You can't separate. Those are the constituent elements of the soul of a story, and a story without soul is just a list of facts or lies, for that matter.
Yeah.
And so we'll be sharing what we've got of that story again very, very soon. And so if the listeners are listening in, they're like, "Confound it, Schmid! Talk about the Iliad, not just these movies and Westworld. It's coming."
Great. Sounds good.
All right. Until next time.
All right. Take care.
Bye.